what's good, self-direct investors? I hope you're all doing great, and I want to welcome you back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Jordan, and today we're coming at you with This Week in Cannabis News from August 21st to the 27th. Now, before we jump in, if you enjoy this video or you learn something, please just leave a like on it as it really helps out my channel. And of course, if you want to learn how to take advantage of this generational investment opportunity, subscribe below so that you don't miss any future videos. And then there's plenty of content for you to go back, rewatch, and educate yourself with. Try to think of it as a time capsule. Try to put all the news and facts in one place so you can watch episodes over time to learn about the evolution of the U.S. cannabis industry. Identify top U.S. MSOs that you keep seeing pop up that you think will be worth more in the future than they are now. And of course, take advantage whenever you feel ready, if you wish to do so, pending whatever incremental reform we're supposed to get from now until the end of the year based on the promises that we've gotten from D.C. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to keep them. They haven't after the last 2 years, but we are hopeful that they might. And so, starting off with Missouri Can Trade providing this update is according to projections from Cannabis Business Times, Missouri is set to be the lone newcomer into the $1 billion club in 2023 with a projected $1.3 billion in combined adult use and medical sales. Congrats, Missouri. Keep it up. You guys are on fire. Well, get this. Total U.S. cannabis sales may reach nearly $30 billion, up 12% from 2022, which I think is still surprising because when you consider how this entire industry is discriminated against continuously by Congress, regulators, and politicians, and they have to operate with both hands tied behind their backs. And yet, despite all those obstacles, the fact that one of the last remaining American-made industries that should be getting way more love than it is still expected to grow at 12% year over year just highlights how much of a state-led growth story this really is and why a lot of the noise at the federal level is really just noise to try and distract us. And ultimately, it proves that more Americans want to vote for legal cannabis with their dollars if given the opportunity. But you already knew that. And so we're going to get into this story. As 8 states projected to be billion-dollar cannabis markets in 2023, the Elite Retail Club includes new and old markets. See which states made the list and which came up short. And there was one new one, Missouri, added over this past year. And so you can pause to read this snippet if you'd like, but main thing I'll bring you down to is this one. Just highlights all the information in one. Otherwise, you can grab the full link in the description to go through it. Mind you, I guess I'll scroll down for Cali if you're interested, but all the states they do cover. But with that, from AZ Mirror, Arizona cannabis sales dipped at the end of spring, and so not all markets are flourishing, and this is more to be expected out of West Coast markets that are close to California that unfortunately do get flooded with some illicit cannabis in the off seasons. And so all that to point out is that Arizona's cannabis market downtrended in May, according to the latest numbers released by the Arizona Department of Revenue, as adult use rec sales dipped to $82.9 million, while medical cannabis sales dropped to just $28.3 million, the lowest since rec sales began in January 2021. And so you can pause read if you're interested, but main takeaway is that May's total was the lowest since September 2022, when the Arizona Department of Revenue reported sales at $80.9 million. And so it doesn't mean that they can't improve, but certainly worth paying attention to, as again, that's the beauty of having 50 different states. The experiment of democracy, or the laboratory of democracy, I think they say. While some states falter, others will pick up where they left off. And so with that, New Jersey, one of the big East Coast states that we think would help pick up some of the slack. Good news is that slowly but surely, although they do not have nearly as many dispensaries as they need, sales hit $160 million in Q2 apparently, and this is as of August 23rd. So for the second quarter of 2023, the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission recorded a 10% increase from the $145.7 million in revenue generated from January through March. After receipts from medicinal cannabis are factored in, sales topped $193.1 million for the latest period, according to the state. And you can imagine this is happening because they're slowly but surely opening more and more dispensaries. Obviously, the more they open, the more sales we're going to see, the more tax revenue, the more jobs, all that, yada, yada. But you can pause to read for this bit, and then I'll scroll down. There's a little bit more here. You can pause to read. Well, there is actually one more visual that I figured I would leave it on. Pause to read. Actually, last bit here. Pause to read if you're interested. Otherwise, full link in the description. But the good news, thank you, Christopher Norman, one of my favorite sources out of New Jersey, is that they're now at 55 cannabis dispensaries, up from what I believe they were at 43 a few months back. So now 40 adult use. So again, 40 adult use only, 15 medicinal. I know of at least 2 more in one municipality that will likely open in the next 2 weeks. Expect many more through the end of 2023. So we're going to stay updated on this. But again, one way to unclog that bottleneck we have on the East Coast is to obviously open more legal outlets so that it can compete with the black market. So thank you, Chris. We appreciate the updates. And this link here, I'll put it in the comments if you happen to be curious about New Jersey and wanted to do a bit more digging. But the last bit out of New Jersey, love seeing justice served, especially towards cannabis users after the discrimination they face from everyone else, especially the DOJ. As Marijuana Moment reports, another New Jersey police officer fired over cannabis must be reinstated. Judge rules. That is real justice. The federal law cited by the respondent in its brief does not preempt the state's cannabis legalization law, because states' rights were always designed to supersede federal rights. That's just the way it is, always has been, why the state-led growth story will continue, and why we will see change at the federal level when, not if. And so, of course, folks, grab this if in the comments if you wanted to read it. But with that, on to Florida. Office of Medical Cannabis Use for this past week, we can take a look and see from August 21st to the 25th, Surterra Wellness did open one location in Miami Beach. And then scrolling up, the qualified patient count did increase to 841,580, which represents an increase week over week of 1,539 patients. So good to see more and more Floridians choosing a safer, non-addictive medicinal alternative. But with that, dispensations from August 18th to the 24th, we can see all the MSOs in the state, the number of active dispensaries that they have in operation, and then we can see for this past week, the number of milligrams of THC sold, milligrams of CBD sold, and ounces of smokable flower sold. And so with that, it seems like Connoisseurs.io took some time off, but he is back and updating his Florida market share comp sheet, so much appreciated there. We can see who's leading in flower, THC, and CBD. Some highlights down here, but main thing is I will just show you the visuals so that you can take a look, pause to read. Otherwise, of course, full link will be in the comments. This one's looking at total THC sales, total CBD sales, and then dispensary count. And certainly we know Trulieve definitely has the head start there. But on to some studies, as we got a lot of good data back this week. First one from Science Direct. From August 15th, 2023, Psychiatry Research, Recreational Cannabis Use Over Time in Individuals at Clinical High Risk for Psychosis. And this is one of Prohibitionists' last remaining arguments, and happily debunking it right here, is lack of associations with symptom, neurocognitive functioning, and treatment patterns. And so get this, read it and weep. From the abstract, recreational cannabis use has recently gained considerable interest as an environmental risk factor that triggers the onset of psychosis. That is the myth. To date, however, the evidence that cannabis is associated with negative outcomes in individuals at clinical high risk for psychosis is inconsistent. Boom. The present study tracked cannabis usage over a 2-year period and examined its associations with clinical and neurocognitive outcomes along with medication rates. So CHR, clinical high-risk youth who continuously use cannabis had higher neurocognition and social functioning over time. What do you know? Fascinating. And decreased medication usage relative to non-users over time. So it actually had the complete opposite effect of what prohibitionists have falsely believed. So surprisingly, clinical symptoms improved over time despite the medication decreases. So another prohibitionist myth debunked. Love to see it. And so more about this study, you can read the methods and results. Full study in the comments, but again, love to see this, pointing out that cannabis does not increase psychosis, or at least has much more beneficial medical applications to psychosis than what prohibitionists falsely thought before. And so with that, from High Times, cannabis use not associated with greater risk of heart attack, study finds, but it might be time to rethink your spliff. So I guess smoking cannabis by itself is obviously different than smoking cannabis mixed with tobacco, but some interesting findings here. You can pause to read the most of it, or the majority of it, but what I wanted to point out, what I thought was so fascinating. Additionally, and fascinatingly, the researchers did identify an increased heart attack risk among the portion of former consumers who had recently quit using cannabis. What? So the users who were frequently using it and that stopped at a point in time were at a greater risk of a potential unexpected heart attack. Like, what the hell? We would never know this if we couldn't study, and so again, reason to deschedule. Obviously, investigators called this latter finding unexpected from normal reports, no doubt. Of course, pause to read for the conclusions if you're interested, but another really interesting note I found when reading through this was how researchers have been looking into the relationship between cannabinoids and cardiovascular function for some time. This interest is because cannabis can increase blood pressure and heart rate from some studies, right? And so that's fair, but once you read this last sentence, as a result, there has been concern in the medical community about a potential correlation between heart attacks and cannabis use. And isn't this sort of a sentence that points out that this is the outcome they've been looking for a long time in the past? And fortunately, they have never found it. And that's why we study this and why cannabis should be descheduled. But when you read a sentence like that, it just highlights that, yeah, well, because of past studies, there's a bit of a bias and they almost want to find a certain confirmation as opposed to another. Yet, the good news, however, they found no consistent data to show that this presents a danger, which makes the new research out of San Diego music to the ears of cannabis, or for cannabis users, as a 2021 literature review of 67 studies published in the American Journal of Medicine found that cannabis itself does not appear to be independently associated with excessive cardiovascular risk factors. Fascinating. Again, we don't know why, but if we deschedule, we'll get closer to that. And then on top of that, however, the authors express concern that it can be associated with other unhealthy behaviors such as alcohol use and tobacco smoking that can be detrimental to heart health. And so the biggest risk is if you happen to be a cannabis user that also drinks a lot of alcohol and smokes a lot of tobacco. And so, of course, cannabis alone seems to be a lot more promising than mixing it with anything else. More here if you wanted to pause to read. Otherwise, grab the full link in the comments. But fascinating, right? And so with that, from ACG Case Reports Journal, but come on, guys, you're a journal. Why the fuck are you running ads on your site? Try to have some integrity. So this one from, when was the date? August 2023. Cannabis improves clinical outcomes and quality of life in patients with chronic pouchitis. And so I didn't want to spend too much time on this because it's very scientific-y, but the main thing to point out is while it's a 9-patient study, so very, very small sample, the introduction said that in animal and in vitro models of UC, which is ulcerative colitis, cannabinoids improved inflammation, and in patients with UC, cannabis as adjuvant therapy improved symptoms and quality of life. And so, main thing they add, however, to date, cannabis as a treatment of chronic pouchitis has not been studied, but of course, it just highlights that it's potentially promising for this. Main reason I wanted to add it in. Full link in the comments, of course, with the rest of the studies. But with that, we got another interesting one from Marijuana Moment. This one I actually found this morning, but obscure cannabinoids or cannabis components hold therapeutic promise for treating skin problems like acne and psoriasis. Study finds. Fascinating. What do you know? New study suggests that some lesser-known cannabinoids produced by hemp and cannabis, with names like THCV, CBDV, CBC, CBM, and CBN, which are new compounds that have been discovered over the last few years despite the limited ability to research. And so, again, more reason to deschedule, may help treat dermatological diseases such as psoriasis, eczema, and acne. And so the findings of this review suggest that minor cannabinoids hold therapeutic promise in the management of dermatological diseases, says the study published this week in the peer-reviewed journal Molecules. Incorporating minor cannabinoids into dermatological therapies could potentially offer new novel treatment options of patients and improve their overall well-being. Well, what do you know? And so this was actually a study I found this morning, so I'll admit I have not read through the entire article, but I wanted to share with you at least the interesting findings if you wanted to read a bit further. So you can pause to read here. Pause to read this bit if you like, otherwise the link will be in the comments. But again, if there's any reason to deschedule, we'd love to see that the data continues to line up, in line with what we're expecting, some sort of rescheduling review before the end of the year. And so with that from Carger, again, why are you guys advertising? Keep your credibility. From August 17th, 2023, medical cannabis alleviates chronic neuropathic pain effectively and sustainably without severe adverse effects. We love to see that, because the main thing we do see is that cannabis does not have the adverse side effects that opioids has. A retrospective study on 99 cases. And so taking a look at the abstract, of course, you can pause to read the whole thing. But main thing, sleep disturbance was significantly improved with the median of scores decreased from 8 to 2. These improvements were sustained over a period of 6 months, and there were no severe adverse events reported. Mild side effects reported were dryness and mucous tissue. We call that cottonmouth, fatigue, and increased appetite. Therapy tolerance was reported in 91% of the interviews. And conclusion, medical cannabis is safe and highly effective for treating neuropathic pain and concomitant sleep disturbance. Boom, read it and weep. Love to see it. And so, of course, more here if you wanted to pause to read. Link in the comments. But with that, from Marijuana Moment, patients say cannabis treats neuropathy just as well as opioids, and most report using high THC cannabis, new survey finds. And I thought this was the same study as the one that I just showed you. It's actually a different one. So love having more and more data find very similar findings. And so the company NugMD, which connects patients to doctors for medical cannabis recommendations, surveyed 603 patients who said neuropathy was either their primary or secondary reason for using cannabis. And because one of the most common symptoms is neuropathy is pain. I think that's a typo. Patients first rated their pain levels on a scale of 1 to 10, both before and after using cannabis as a treatment. And the results, which were shared exclusively with Marijuana Moment, showed clear signs of relief that cannabis fucking works. The average pain level before cannabis use was 7.64, while the average pain level after cannabis use was 3.44. The study found that amounts to an average pain relief level of 4.2 out of 10 for participants. And so, sounds very promising. I don't know about you. Let me know what you think in the comments. So there's more here if you wanted to pause to read. And I think they compare what some other substances or pharmaceutical treatments did for the pain tolerance. But anyways, more here if you wanted to pause to read. Otherwise, full link in the comments to go through it. Well, we've got a few more studies just to touch on Marijuana Moment. Actually, this is an op-ed, but let's dispel the myth that cannabis and tobacco smoke are equally hazardous to health. We know this is a fact. They are not. For whatever reason, we don't necessarily know it because cannabis has been stuck in the Schedule 1, so we haven't been able to study it. But for whatever reason, cannabis does not have the same effect on human lungs that tobacco has. And this also reigns true from 1996. Donald Tashkin was, from what I understand, the foremost leading lung expert in the U.S. out of UCLA. And he had determined from all his research that not a single patient he had come across had developed any sort of cancer from cannabis use alone. And that being said, it is certainly fascinating if you did not know this, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Just wanted to share it if you didn't know and you were interested in learning more. And so link in the comments, of course. And last one for Marijuana Moment, as Americans view cannabis as safer than alcohol and cigarettes, as rates of cannabis use surpass tobacco smoking, Gallup poll finds. And as a young, naive teenager that found cannabis and thought, how is this illegal and alcohol is not? Never really thought this day would come, but hey, it's come sooner than I really, would have believed had I had the courage to do so in the past. But many Americans, common sense, believe cannabis is less harmful than alcohol, cigarettes, vapes, and other tobacco products. Main thing to point out is the findings here. It's still just mind-boggling to me that even 16% of Americans can, with a straight face, say that their alcohol is not at all harmful. Like, come on. It's just, obviously, in moderation, use it responsibly. But just to say that it's not at all harmful when it's responsible for like 40% of crime is just redonkulous. Anyways, all that to say, we know that cannabis is the leader now, where most Americans understand that it is not dangerous and not at all that harmful if you use it in moderation and responsibly. And so a bit more down here if you wanted to pause to read. Otherwise, full link in the comments. And before we get to some DC updates, just wanted to share this last visual from Mark Landers as a sweet reminder of what happens when you end cannabis prohibition at the state level. You provide jobs and opportunity to those in America that need it the most, essentially the American workers that have been fucked over by one of the most underrated crimes of the last 2 decades, outsourcing every American industry overseas to cut costs and increase gross profit margins for the few that have equity in those companies, again at the expense of Americans who now cannot find sustainable jobs in order to raise their family and chase the American dream, what we were all promised as a kid. It's a damn shame, but good point, Mark. Imagine how this has grown now, and while this was just 2018, obviously these states have benefited the most by providing opportunities, and since then more and more states have come on board. And I do forget exactly when the dates were, but at one point the total Americans employed apparently was 420,000, and that had gotten so close to almost 500,000, I believe. But imagine the fact that SAFE hasn't passed even since the Dems took over in 2020. None of these employees can still open bank accounts, from my understanding. And I can't imagine how they continue to do it. But a lot of them are really the heroes keeping this industry alive and going as we continue to reach a tipping point and hopefully see rescheduling by the end of this year. And so with that, from Semi-Evolved Mammal, as a new Republican co-sponsor for the Safe Banking Act signed in the House today. And so we love to see it, although we certainly need to see more action in the Senate than the House at this point. But welcome aboard, Rep. Greg Stubbe. And so thanks for that update, Semi-Evolved Mammal. And with that, from Marijuana Moment, while we did see a few weeks back testimony from the head of the DEA saying that they would provide an update, of course, she didn't do her job, or she's not very efficient. Otherwise, if I was the head of the DEA, I would have this updated ASAP. Fortunately, I'm not. But Marijuana Moment, GOP congressman pushes DEA head for update on Biden's cannabis scheduling review. So again, Matt Gaetz, MVP in the cannabis space, at least for now, or holding people accountable, it is important for the administration to be transparent with Congress regarding where the process of descheduling cannabis stands. And so we love to see him again following up on what he gave in the testimony and trying to force the head of the DEA to keep her word and provide an update on how this is coming along. And so of course, full article in the comments if you wanted to read that. Well, from the Green Market Report, as Cresco CEO still believes federal reform is possible. Do you? According to him, the right legislators are having the right conversations right now. Well, that's promising. And while I am still hopeful that we will see cannabis rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, because that is the best way to help the cannabis industry while keeping control into the government's hands, unfortunately, I see that as the best possible compromise. Not really anything we don't already know here, so of course I invite you to pause to read, but I think the main takeaway down here is that rather Bachtel believes, Bachtel also downplayed fears among many in the industry that a possible rescheduling from 1 to 3, which has been touted as the likely outcome of the current rescheduling review by the admin, would not actually result in stricter federal oversight. He said concerns are exaggerated. So that's at least what I thought was interesting and worth sharing. Otherwise, full link in the comment if you wanted to read through it. But this is certainly a more informative listen with CEO of Cresco Labs, Charles Bachtel, essentially highlighting that he obviously thought SAFE was going to pass probably last year. And the main reason why the deal with Columbia Care fell through, of course, is because SAFE didn't pass and because the Dems fucked over everyone in the industry by, lying to them. And unfortunately, for that reason, the licenses that they had in New York, the extra ones that they thought that they could sell for, money that they could get back for the deal, unfortunately, they became worthless because social equity means no one can open a dispensary in New York, and that's why we now have 1,500 illegal dispensaries, and I think like 20 legal ones at this point, and only after the continued pressure we've seen from the last 6 months. And so it is very sad, but I did listen to this, and I was reassured that Cresco is going to be fine in time, and that I still really think something big is going to happen from now into the new year and probably into 2024. And so all I can do is accumulate cash, keep it on the sideline for now, probably start accumulating into Green Thumb and increase my position in Air Wellness. I'm not going to increase my position in Cresco. I've sunk enough money into there. But what do you think? Please let me know in the comments if you happen to listen to this or what you think about the whole situation, because obviously we ought to be skeptical still after waiting this long. But all I can really say is, just thinking out loud, deep down, is if over the next 12 to 18 months we get fooled again, hey, shame on us for trusting, even given all the news and everything that's happening at the state level, why it's hard to believe that we'll get nothing, especially with an election coming up. But all that to say is, if that is the case, I think it just points out that there's a much bigger problem in America, the fact that elected officials, for whatever reason, usually power, greed, and money is the cause of those two things, taking over, your ability to think straight or, be a human and think of others first, which sadly has already become obvious for anyone with a pair of eyes. But for example, if by this time next year we still get nothing from the Dems, it's hard to believe, but fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool us all a third, fourth, and fifth time. Get the elected officials who are anti-American and have been working actively against America for the last however many years out of office immediately. Otherwise, we've already been living in hell, so it can't get much worse, right, folks? Only up from here for this cannabis industry. I really do believe it. But with that, from Curaleaf, as they celebrate launch of adult use sales at Manchester, Connecticut dispensary, as Curaleaf Manchester is the company's 4th dispensary in Connecticut to commence adult use sales. And so one of the new East Coast markets to come online for adult use. Less competition there. Curaleaf with a 4th now, obviously trying to get as much market share as possible. But you can pause to read here if you're interested. Otherwise, full link in the comments. And for what it's worth, just figured I would share this from Financial Times for anyone curious about Curaleaf. As cannabis group Curaleaf targets German windfall. Company expects to be selling the drug for rec use by the end of next year, so 2024, not 2023. So while this article doesn't really tell us anything we don't already know, you can pause to read if you haven't seen any of my last week's videos, but I think the main update is that under the plan approved this week, which is phase 1, adults will initially be allowed to buy up to 50 grams of the plant a month from not-for-profit clubs or cultivate up to 3 plants at home. So again, no commercial market, but a second phase, which does not yet have a start date, so no timeline, will trial limited commercial sales, from which Curaleaf and likely Tilray and any other Canadian LP that also has a footprint here could expect to benefit in the future. And so more here if you wanted to pause to read. Of course, otherwise full link in the description. But with that, some news out of Alabama from Marijuana Moment is Verano. Obviously, we saw this one coming. Sues the Alabama medical cannabis regulators over decision not to award license in the second round, essentially replacing Verano with a local Alabama company, and that was the only change. And so that is why Verano is suing them, no doubt. They have every right to. The latest suit asserts regulators exceeded their authority when revoking a previously awarded license due to questions over how applications were scored. And so I'm not a shareholder in Verano, so I'm not getting too deep into the weeds in this, but however, if you were interested, link will be in the comments. I'm not against buying Verano in the future as well, but I think Green Thumb is at least the best choice for me at the moment if I were to purchase any in the near term. But with that from Verano, just a statement from them. We remain ready, willing, and able to invest $40 million in Alabama, creating jobs, growing best-in-class products, and serving patients across the state. See, this is some pretty good leverage to make the argument as to why, they don't want to go back on what they had previously announced. But all that to say, this is from Verano and their statement to Governor Ivey and the citizens of Alabama. So we'll see how that goes. I will update you. But with that from Marijuana Moment, as Ohio officials approve ballot language for cannabis legalization initiative that will go before voters in November. You'd love to see it, as the Ohio ballot board voted 5-0 to adopt cannabis language that was drafted in the past week by the Secretary of State's office. So we'll love to see it out of Ohio. And so this is the language they came up with. The text of the approved summary language for the initiative, designated as Issue 2, says the measure would legalize and regulate the cultivation, processing, sale, purchase, possession, home grow, and use of cannabis by adults at least 21 years of age. Sounds like a promising program. For those in Ohio, it explains that a division of cannabis control would be created to regulate, investigate, and penalize adult use cannabis operators, adult use testing labs, and individuals required to be licensed, while further the summary describes how the initiative would establish a social equity program, yada yada. Hopefully they go more in line with what Missouri did as opposed to Maryland, but both are on fire, so I wouldn't be complaining at all. And so anyways, you can pause to read, otherwise full link in the comments. But with that from Hirsch Jane, this was a podcast that I have not tuned into yet, but I do plan to listen later. A good 10-minute summary of the Ohio ballot initiative starts at 4:45. December 23, home grow allowed. June 24th would be adult use regulations finalized. September 24th would see adult use sales begin. 50 social equity retail licenses issued, then a 2-year moratorium where I don't believe any would be added after, which I don't think sounds that promising. Well, Ohio GOP hates weed may try to modify initiative, and so let's hope that they don't. It's so annoying when some GOP members do like it and some don't. If anyone is using blue and red anymore, you're missing the point that it's government versus the individual now. But all that to say, if you wanted to tune in, you can grab the link in the comments. But I did want to bring you back to this because actually I might as well show you. Here are the key provisions of the legalization ballot measures that appear on the November ballot. And so this is what would be included. The initiative would legalize. You can read from there down to adult use. And then a bit more information here. Essentially, more information on these snippets here, but all this to say is that if it does happen, we can see September 2024 adult use begin in Ohio. That's really unfortunate. Would have loved to see it much sooner, like we saw out of Arizona or Missouri. Hopefully, GOP doesn't get in the way, and maybe they can speed up that start date. But still good news for Ohio. Better late than never. And so with that, out of St. Louis, Missouri, the next big thing in cannabis could be coming to St. Louis, which are consumption lounges. And so while I do believe California, Nevada, there's a few others I forget exactly off the top of mind, maybe Boston, but some are starting with it. Basically just to point out that these could be coming to St. Louis soon as well. Of course, legislation is going to have to be written up and passed, but figured I would share this for anyone interested. Full link in the comments. So I invite you to pause to read. I'm not going to spend too much time on this as I want to update you once these are actually coming to Missouri, but all that to say is a bit on the fact that that might be a thing coming soon, and more on the link in the comments if you wanted to read through that. But with that, from High Times, just figured I would share this from Colorado, because while Colorado is the most mature market in the country and it's starting to see its massive sales decline a little bit, it's not lacking in the cannabis tax revenue. And in fact, cannabis making way more tax revenue than everything else. Why isn't alcohol taxed at a lot higher rate, especially considering the cost that alcohol has on society? Absolutely mind-boggling. But $282.3 million from cannabis, $233 million from cigarettes, $60.5 million from tobacco, $56.4 million from nicotine, $56.1 million from alcohol. These literally kill hundreds of thousands of people a year. How are they not taxed higher than cannabis, right? Mind-boggling. And so more on this in the comments, but this is something for the future we should really try and to fix, because we should not be paying more for something that is less dangerous as these fucking substances. God damn it. You should not pay more tax for something that's healthier. That's so backwards. So from Microsoft, MSN.com, that's where I found the source. South Dakota has issued 11,437 cannabis cards. And the whole point of this story, why that's a surprise, is because Seal said the original projection was that the State Department of Health would issue 6,000 patient cards by the third year of the program, while the department has already issued almost double of that already. And so clearly what they thought was going to be the case, it was actually exceeded by, again, almost double. And hopefully this just means that they might acknowledge that when citizens of South Dakota want legal adult use, like they voted for in 2020, the governor shouldn't step in and claim that she knows best for, the state, because clearly that's not democracy. But all that to say is hopefully South Dakota, with this progress, is going to see a bit more of their program open up and maybe see adult use become a fact, as it should have been in 2020. But with that, from Wisconsin Law Journal, an update that legalizing cannabis could add $36 million in tax revenue to Wisconsin. It's not a lot, as Wisconsin is a small state, but it is more than New York has done already thus far. And so more here if you wanted to learn about what Wisconsin could get if they were to legalize for adult use, as I think they're a sea of illegality amongst many new legal markets. And so they're just losing out on the tax revenue. Might as well do this sooner than later. But with that, from Marijuana Moment, New York could see $1.2 billion in cannabis sales annually if the market didn't roll out, or the program didn't roll out like it did in the last 2 years. But get this, licensing hiccups and an unregulated market are holding it back, city economist says. Well, I get the idea that the city economists cannot bite the hand that feeds them, otherwise they're going to get fired, much like if you try and tell the truth in Canada. But what I get out of this is that the city economists are saying it without saying it, that the politicians, regulators, and policymakers are fucking idiots. And that is what has caused, unfortunately, the glut in New York. And it is important to take a realistic look at when and whether New York can count on this fiscal boost. Unfortunately, while Marxists are in charge, they can't, because Marxists are not realist. They're idealist. It's what they want to have happen. It's not what can function and practically work. And so New York could eventually see cannabis sales reach 1.2 billion annually, not anytime soon, resulting in about 47 million local tax revenue. They might get a little bit more tax revenue than Wisconsin if they can get their head out of their asses sooner than later. Like, how pathetic. Never could have imagined it would have gone this way, but it is what it is. Full link in the comments, but good update out of New York from Brad Racino as the OCM's list of CAURD licensees who met all requirements for licensing but had not received approval to open prior to August 7th. So despite what we're hearing from the New York OCM and Regulatory Commission, that is 30 more stores that could have been opened in New York. And so you cannot blame the fact that they're not open on them whatsoever, because they had reached all the requirements but did not get approval. So you can only put the blame on the incompetent, idiot OCM and everyone else involved in this shit show thus far. And so with that, though, from the Green Market Report, New York regulators named 30 dispensaries eligible to open under court order. And so this is just basically touching off of this last story, including the same ones. And so from my understanding, only 30 conditional adult use retail dispensary licenses in New York would be eligible to open in the coming weeks under conditions outlined in a preliminary injunction issued by State Judge Kevin Bryant recently, state officials noted in a court filing Tuesday, which means that the current number of 23 operational cannabis retailers in the state could jump to 53 in the near future if all successfully launch. Well, can you give them the fucking chance to do so since they've met all the requirements and it's only the OCM standing in the way? So I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, and it just seems like the OCM wants to do things their way and further, provide equal outcomes to everybody at whichever speed they want to do it. And again, so unprofessional, so un-American. They ought to have lost their jobs years ago. Hopefully we can make that a thing sooner than later, and this will result in some of them being forced to step down. But all that to say is you can pause to read if you're interested, essentially just detailing what we already know is that these 30 might get the shot if the OCM will allow them to. But hey, hopefully that is the case, and we'll get 30 more stores online in New York where they're needed more than ever. Another one out of New York, a small win, as we previously saw these announced, and then we saw that taken back, saying the farmers markets can't happen. Now they're announced again, and so we're seeing a farmers market open alongside New York State Fair. We are happy to see large-scale showcase come to life only minutes from the great New York State Fair, so attendees can learn about the industry and purchase and enjoy products. And so I think a lot of this is going to be the hemp grown from New York farmers being sold through there. I mean, it's possible it's going to be good cannabis. I don't know. But we know that it's not any registered operators that are providing medical, or likely any of the 23 existing operators that can sell there, from my understanding. I could be wrong, but more on the link in the comments if you wanted to read through this. Hey, good luck, New York farmers. But last one, thought I would point out, because this is just an interesting anomaly that you could only get out of New York. There is one legal dispensary on Long Island, so naturally for them, business is booming. 1,100 consumers spend about $100 each on average daily, while 35 other businesses licensed to open in Nassau and Suffolk have yet to find locations. So you just wonder, how did this end up being? Who owns this one? What favor did they do with the OCM? I don't know. Now, the main unfortunate thing is this is behind a paywall. So if you happen to know more, let me know. But I was just curious, because it's just like, obviously this can only be allowed by the OCM determining whoever this one legal operator is to get that head start. And then the other 35 are fucked and having to wait, because of the incompetence from the same group that allowed this one guy to thrive. And with that, we've got an update out of Minnesota, as the Star Tribune shares first month of Minnesota's cannabis tax nets the state nearly $600K. And I thought some of this would come from the dispensaries that were approved on native or indigenous land, as they have different rules and can follow steps early and apply and get one of those approved, versus the rest of Minnesota that sadly has to wait until August of 2025 to launch a legal adult use commercial market that sells flower. Pretty silly, I know. That's just how they wrote it up. But the July haul is a partial snapshot of the state's hemp-derived THC gummy and drink market, which I believe was an accident, but came into play when they signed the legalization bill into effect last year. Or maybe earlier this year, I forget exactly when that was. But if July proves to have been a typical month for Minnesota's existing hemp-derived THC market, annual sales for those products could surpass $70 million, based on the 1 month so far, amounting to $7 million tax revenue haul for the state each year. As the Department of Revenue told the Star Tribune it had received more than $594,000 from 571 businesses for July sales, and noted the number could rise with late filings and returns still being processed. But while legal since last summer, hemp-derived THC products have just become subject to a special 10% tax included in the state's cannabis legalization law that passed this year. And so it seems like from last year until this year, until they signed that bill into law, there was no tax whatsoever. It seems like that was a great free-for-all for anyone who could try and capitalize on that opportunity, straight profit. But now there's a 10% tax. All that to say, what we get from Star Tribune, all signs point to continued growth for the market. That's typically what we see for any new cannabis market, why all states ought to get on board with this. But more here if you wanted to pause to read. Well, I'll bring you down to the last bit. And that's essentially it for this article. Otherwise, full link in the description to go through that. While another unexpected market, but from MJ Biz Daily, Mississippi's medical cannabis sales eclipsed 4.4 million in July. Woo! Keeping up with New York's legal sales. But with that, medical cannabis retailers in Mississippi sold 4.4 million, up 15.3% from June. That's a big jump, according to state data provided by MJ Biz Daily, or provided to MJ Biz Daily, my apologies. The July total marked the 6th straight month of increased sales since the state launched a medical cannabis retail program in late January, Department of Revenue statistics show. And I'm sure anyone in Mississippi that needs or wants access to a safer, non-addictive medicinal alternative is very happy for it. And so since launching, the program has sold 15.7 million worth of products. They've issued provisional licenses to 138 dispensaries, 47 cultivators, 8 processors, 4 transportation entities, 3 state-mandated disposal companies, and 2 testing labs. Despite the number of eligible retailers in the state, only a handful began selling medical cannabis in late January. So way more to come online, meaning way more growth, much like we're seeing in Minnesota. And Minnesota is going to be big come August 2025. Next year, this time, Minnesota is going to be a very different picture, but a little bit more down here if you wanted to pause to read on how that came to be. So with that, from other stories, Marijuana Moment, more than a year after being confronted with errors in FBI cannabis data, DOJ punts investigation to the FBI itself. Really just highlighting that the FBI, the DOJ, all these agencies that we used to trust have become shit shows. Don't know why. Obviously, something worth looking into. Maybe time to abolish some of them, or at least fire a lot of the staff that isn't necessarily needed. But the FBI is generating data that leads to distorted pictures of what the police are doing, the activist who filed the complaint said. And so obviously this comes from an activist. I'm sure they don't give a fuck because it's coming from an activist. But after a year of doing nothing, they just punt it back to the FBI. It was like, fuck. That's just exemplary of what the DOJ has become under the current administration. Very sad, weaponized against the American people, and to be unproductive, sadly. But with that, from Marijuana Moment, another stupid agency that should be abolished. World Anti-Doping Agency experts, they're not experts then if this is what they come up with, say cannabis use violates the spirit of sport, no it doesn't, and makes athletes unfit role models. Bull fucking shit. If anything, new data that I've shown from studies have proven the opposite. And I mean, if anything, all the stories from athletes who use cannabis, 80% of the NBA, NFL, NHL, it's all proven the opposite. And so the World Anti-Doping Agency is obviously out of touch with reality, and their officials acknowledge that cannabis can benefit athletes by facilitating recovery and inducing pain. Yet they have such cognitive dissonance that they can acknowledge this, yet they have to determine this. They're complete idiots. And so more on this, if you wanted to waste some time reading through what this agency thinks should be true. Clearly it's not, thank the Lord, because they're not based in reality. But all that to say is Sha'Carri Richardson recently, I think it was last week, competed and won the 100-meter world champion. And this comes after she tested positive for cannabis after qualifying for the 2020 Olympics and was removed from the U.S. team. But now she's back proving cannabis is for winners. So all that to say is fuck you, the World Anti-Doping Agency. You guys are idiots. Clearly you don't know what you're talking about. And athletes are going to continue proving you wrong. And so if you want to get ahead of the curve, take cannabis out of your, banned substances lists or lists of narcotics, because it never belonged there in the first place. Love to see Sha'Carri keep crushing it. And so with that, from MJ Biz Daily, Canadian rec cannabis sales jumped 12% in June to 426 million Canadian. And while this might be unexpected, this continued growth I think is very promising for Q3 and what we hope to expect some sort of news rescheduling announcement in the coming months. As it's also the fourth straight month that Canada's sales exceeded 400 million, according to the latest retail sales data by StatsCan. So we love to see this. I was fearing a little bit that the growth would slow down in Canada, but as they're opening more and more dispensaries to properly supply the demand, because we've got 14 million people in Ontario, they started with 50, slowly got up to 100, 200. Now there's like 1,300 or 1,400 dispensaries per capita. They're properly supplying the demand in Ontario, and at least that is how Ontario continues to lead the way, up 9.9% compared to June, because, you know, they're providing legal outlets for people to actually purchase from. So, of course, Ontario was first, Alberta second in line, and it's funny because they're not our second most populated province, but they are the province that went with the private model from the get-go, and that's why they are a leader in sales month over month as well, while British Columbia third place with 66 million, and then sadly Quebec again, our second most populated province, but they've only got a limited number, 25, maybe 50 dispensaries max, and they don't want to open anymore because they're happy with that. Pretty pathetic. They could be making so much more, similarly in line to maybe not 167, but over 100 million every single month. Very well could. They just choose not to, which is sad. But so essentially that's it, what we touched on, and a bit more down here if you wanted to pause to read. With that, we got this one from Euronews.next. Germany is set to make cannabis legal. Where does the rest of Europe stand on cannabis use? And so just figured I would share this for anyone interested in Europe. While medical cannabis is becoming more available in Europe, cannabis remains illegal in most EU countries for personal use, except for Malta, Germany, Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and Luxembourg. It seems to be the case. Well, can you go to jail for having cannabis in your possession? Blue represents penalties include incarceration. Mid blue, penalties without incarceration, and then light blue, no penalty. And so clearly there's no penalty, or no EU country has no penalty yet, but it seems leading the way, penalty without incarceration, you got Portugal, Spain, Malta, Italy, Netherlands, England, I think that's Czech Republic. I don't remember that country. And so while Europe is a lot slower at getting any of this done, because while we unfortunately learned over these last 6 months that European countries don't actually have national sovereignty over their own drug laws, and they have to abide by what the UN says, and this old outdated 1961 Single Drugs Convention put in place by one of the most costliest and racist Americans of all time, sadly still preventing people in these countries from getting access to a safer, non-addictive medicinal alternative, which obviously sucks. But the good news is that pilot programs for medical, it has started in a lot of countries, or at least there's been a lot of talk. And from that talk, sadly, the action is always very slow, but at least some are starting. Denmark, Ireland, France, Czech Republic, and Germany. And in my last video, Switzerland, I think, has seen the most success from pilot programs. Had one big one launch. A second one is starting. And so with that, where is medical cannabis legal in Europe? Legal is bright green. Dark green is illegal, and then this shade of green for pilot programs. And then international legal status changing. More here if you wanted to pause to read. Otherwise, full link in the comments. But with that, from the Toronto Star, so take it with a grain of salt, because wouldn't trust any government-funded Canadian publications at this point. Take them all with a grain of salt. But according to them, Bahamas introduces bill to legalize cannabis for medical and religious purposes. Love to see this initiative being taken place. Bahamas, as the government of the Bahamas has unveiled several bills aimed at legalizing cannabis for medical and religious purposes and decriminalizing possession of small amounts, joining other Caribbean nations that have taken similar steps. And so still early on, but you can pause to read this bit if you're interested. Otherwise, full link in the description. But I will update you once we actually get some progress on this, seeing it move through chambers. And so with that, from causes, what we were told would happen before August recess, obviously the can got kicked down the road again, because that's just what happens in Congress with anything related to cannabis, sadly. But all that to say is, according to Schmuck, before the August recess, cannabis and the Safe Banking Act would be a priority in September when they return. And so will he keep his word? Only time will tell, but in the near term, if folks, you wouldn't mind, I know I've asked you many times, but if anyone's new to this channel and you don't know what the Safe Banking Act is, or you have yet to reach out to your state reps, please consider helping, as the bill should banks offer service to cannabis businesses. 100%. It'll make America safer, get cash into the banking system off the streets, and lead to less people dying, save lives, because less dispensaries become targets for armed robberies because they have so much cash. And so of course, those are all valid reasons that you can give. You can click on Contact U.S. Reps. Unfortunately, you have to give your email. So, of course, you can always Google whoever your rep is and contact them directly. I think that might be even better. Leave a message to the person in their office. When they actually speak to people, it goes a long way. But there's more here, just details of the bill. Safe Banking Act, bill overview, pause to read, especially just if you're new. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know enough about this. You've already done this, so possibly just skip this. What's in the bill? what it would do: prevent regulators from penalizing financial institutions, recognizes the legality of state-sanctioned cannabis businesses, protects financial institutions from liability, and then just more examples what supporters are saying if you're trying to think of what you could say to your state rep, from Patty Murray from Washington and Senator Merkley. Fuck what opponents are saying. I mean, I guess it's good to know. You got to know their arguments so that you can beat them. I guess that's the one reason to look for that. But that is it for today, folks. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and I really hope you got some value out of it. What did you think of the stories mentioned? Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or suggestions, and I'd be happy to address them. But besides that, if you enjoyed this video and you learned something, please just leave a like on it. Subscribe below if you don't want to miss any future videos, and I will catch you next week for This Week in Cannabis News. Have a great week, everybody. Take care.